Hello, Stitchers. Welcome to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. I'm your host, Lisa Woolford. I'm a fourth-generation sewing enthusiast with more than 20 years of sewing experience. I am looking forward to today's conversation, so sit back, relax, and get ready to get your stitch together.
Hey, friends. Hey, it's Lisa from Black Women Stitch and the Stitch Please podcast, and I am delighted to be starting this February, this Black History Month, with, as I always say, a very special episode. Because this episode is with Elizabeth Way, Associate Curator at the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology, and the curator of Anne Lowe, an American Couturier. And this exhibit is not just an exhibit, it is also a monograph, which means that it is a book, and the book is as beautiful as it is well and thoroughly researched. It also is a symposium. So Elizabeth Way has taken Anne Lowe from being someone who was mentioned in the history of fashion, sometimes as a footnote, sometimes not even at all, and turned her into the main attraction that she is over-deserved to be. And so June Jordan has written, "We are the ones that we have been waiting for." And when I think about Elizabeth Way, that is exactly what I think. Elizabeth Way, welcome to the Stitch Please podcast, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be in conversation with you.
I am going to get us started with, what is your sewing story? If you have one, we know you as a scholar and a curator and a researcher, but I think you also said you were interested in design at one point. And so can you talk about your sewing story?
Yeah, so when I was a kid, I grew up in a pretty rural space in Southern Maryland. I loved fashion. I read Vogue magazine as a preteen, as a teenager, and I wanted to be a fashion designer. So I studied fashion design in my undergraduate education. I also studied history because I loved history. And I went on to study pattern making. So I did work for a very, very brief time as a pattern maker in the New York fashion industry, where I, created patterns and sewed a lot. That didn't quite work out for me. It wasn't what I expected. And so I transitioned into theater costuming. So I was a stitcher in a costume shop and also an assistant costume designer. And at that point, I decided to make a change, and I went to graduate school where I transitioned to fashion studies. And that's where my curatorship stems from.
That is so exciting. And can you talk with us about, what does a curator do? We have heard things like curate your Instagram feed or whatever. But you went to school to study this. Can you tell us about what is the process or the role that a curator takes on when they agree to do a project?
So curators curate exhibitions, and so really we're using historical material culture. Other curators use art and other objects to tell historical narratives or contemporary narratives. It's really, how do we tell stories and convey information through objects? So I do a lot of writing, I do a lot of research, but I do get to interact with fashion objects all the time in our own collection and other collections. And that's really a privilege to see these beautiful things that people have sewn in the past.
And what I appreciate about it is that you kind of have your head on a swivel. You know how to sew, you know how to make patterns, you do costuming, and then you say, I would rather study and teach, because I think that museum exhibitions also are teaching institutions, and we learn so much. And so when you do your writing, when you start to create something like a caption, for example, or a description for a catalog, how does your research impact that process? You can only put so much on a card, right? You only get so much space. Can you talk about what it means to compress what you know from your years and decades of study into a 200-word card that we might look at on a placard?
So it's a huge challenge to distill all that information. So you really have to be choosy, and really in a label, in an exhibition for an object, you can really only convey about one, maybe two pieces of information. So it's really about choosing the most important story. And for me, I always want it to connect back to the object. I want that information to make you go back and look at that object instead of just telling you like a little factoid. And my experiences in sewing and pattern making has really helped me kind of decipher objects, kind of realize the kind of information I want to convey about them.
And I think that that shows in the way that you talk about the work of Anne Lowe, the way that you identify the pieces, the way that you're able to read a garment and to see what is required for it to do the work. We hear the word couture and talk about that word a lot, but I would love for you to define for us what couture is, and do you see a difference between couture and haute couture?
So there is a difference between haute couture and couture. Haute couture is designated by a labor union governing body in France called the Chambre syndicale. And this is an organization that was started in the 19th century. And in the same way that like champagne has to be from the region of Champagne, haute
Yes.
couture has kind of designated itself as Parisian designers who make custom made to order fashion. And so, in a wider sense, couture, especially the way I use it with Anne Lowe, refers to made to measure clothing, as opposed to ready to wear that you can buy in lots of different sizes off the rack. So, Anne Lowe made custom clothing for each individual client, but it was also of the highest quality. It was innovative design. So it's this very high level of design and construction. So haute couture is specific to Paris, but she was definitely working on that same level.
And I think that this is why when you were saying before that when the Merriweather Post heiress took Anne, like when they met up in Paris and she was taking her around and introducing her as Anne Lowe, head of the American House of Lowe, that that was a big deal. Can you talk about why that was so significant for this woman, this heiress, to do this with Anne Lowe?
Well, Paris was the global fashion capital, and it had been since the 18th century. And every other kind of designer or person interested in fashion around the Western world, whether you lived in the United States or Australia, you were looking to Paris for your trends. It's really not until the 1970s that Americans kind of come out under the shadow of Paris. So Anne Lowe, like every designer in America at that time, would have been observing these trends in Paris. And Lowe actually went to Paris as a fashion reporter. The black newspaper, the New York Age, sent her in 1949 to cover the couture shows, and she created a design kind of based on it, which was photographed in the newspaper. So it
Yes.
was there that she ran into her client, Marjorie Merriweather Post, who was heir to the Post cereal fortune. Of course, we still know Post cereal today, but she was a huge couture client. And when she introduced Anne Lowe to Christian Dior as, the proprietor of the House of Lowe, she was putting her on the same level as the French haute couturiers. And this was really unusual because many of her clients, she sewed for the most elite white women in the United States, Rothschilds, DuPonts, Rockefellers. But few of them kind of acknowledged her as their designer. There was much less prestige in having a dress made by an American designer than a French couturier. But Post was not having that. And she really kind of advocated for Lowe as similar on the same level to the French couturiers.
And I really appreciate that because what we see in the same way you said, the same way that champagne can only come from a region of France, the French are pretty good about doing this. They are talk about gatekeeping. I'm sure there's a special word for it in French, right? They're the same people that created this association in the 17th century about which words were allowed to be introduced into the French language. They are incredibly protective of their cultural assets, you know?
Yes.
So I really appreciate that she says, you know what? Guess who's just as good, as you all, Anne Lowe, right? Let's back up a bit and talk about your thesis, because I want to kind of get a sense of the journey that you took. Your thesis was on Elizabeth Keckley, an enslaved seamstress who also worked for Mary Todd Lincoln and was her dressmaker for quite some time. And I think she used her sewing skills to buy her freedom, I believe. And
Yes.
then we have Anne Lowe on the other side of this, being someone who was born in 1898. And that is like being the first generation in her family to be born into freedom. Can you talk a little bit about what type of confluences or intersections you saw between Keckley and Lowe?
Well, I first discovered Keckley and Lowe during an internship that I had with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. So this was way back in 2012, before they had their beautiful museum. We were working in office space, and I worked under a curator named Elaine Nichols. And so I had already had a year of grad school under my belt, and I took a lot of fashion history, but I had never heard of these Black designers. the Smithsonian acquired the collection of the Black Fashion Museum, which was created by Lois K. Alexander, a phenomenal figure in Black fashion. But the Smithsonian had this big collection, and they were looking for kind of interns to do initial research on it. And so it was digging through these papers and these spreadsheets that I first discovered Keckley and Lowe. And I was so fascinated by them because they both have incredible life stories of just the perseverance and their talent. But in my master's thesis, which I decided to write my master's thesis on them, I kind of positioned them as what I think of as transitional designers. So we have
Mm.
so many enslaved dressmakers in the United States who are almost anonymous. There's a couple of pieces of material culture in museums, a few accounts in scattered journals, but we don't know much about them. But Keckley and Lowe were able in different ways to transform that enslaved labor into free labor. Keckley did it through her
Mm.
transition from enslavement to freedom. Lowe did that by learning the enslaved skills of her grandmother and mother and, always working as a free woman. But they were really important in kind of this transition of Black fashion labor. And this is happening before what we think of as kind of the celebrity fashion designer that we really see come up in the 1960s and 70s. So they sit between anonymous enslaved dressmakers and designers like Stephen Burrows and Scott Barry and Willie Smith, who are working in the
Oh,
ready-to-wear industry. So this is, and
right.
even though they, are separated by decades, they do have these very similar ways of working, which are these beautiful 19th century artisanal kind of craft and knowledge around artisanship.
No, I think that transition is a beautiful phrase because it talks about the ways in which fashion and sewing and design are constantly in motion, that this is not a static process. And the reason that people come to fashion or find it so intriguing is because it is so active, that there's so many changes that can be on the horizon. I wanted to talk a little bit about Anne Lowe and her work as someone who would outfit the elite. I think there was a little quote that she might have said something about she doesn't sew for Sally Sue or something like that. Like you have, I don't know, I know you know what it is, but that her work was, um, the things that she did were for people who could only for the people who could afford it. Like it was one of those, if you have to ask how much, you really should not be having an Ann Lowe dress. Like that is not going to be for you. Can you talk about like what it meant for her to straddle so many different levels of society to kind of come from a very labor intensive, a background that might have been marked by poverty that was mitigated because she had these skills, but also some folks not wanting to pay what the work was worth, et cetera. Can you share a little bit about that and that challenge?
Absolutely. So Lowe learned dressmaking from her grandmother and mother, and her grandmother had been enslaved. She gained her freedom through her husband about 1860. And Lowe was born at the end of the 19th century, and she grew up as a child learning these skills. But what I think is just as important that I'm sure her grandmother and mother taught her was how to navigate these social relationships with these elite white women. She was born in Clayton, Alabama, and her grandmother and mother established a shop in Montgomery, Alabama. During the 1910s, their clients included the governor's wife. So these
Wow.
Black women were mixing with these elite women who, in a lot of ways, these social structures hadn't changed very much since enslavement. So these were
Agreed.
savvy women who knew how to navigate this. And I'm sure they taught Lowe and her sisters how to do this. And so we see Lowe throughout her career attain these positions of recognition as an expert, but also have to make all of these concessions because of her race and her gender. For example,
Mm.
there's an amazing article that was written about her in the Tampa Tribune, I believe, a Tampa newspaper in the 1920s. She'd
Mhm.
moved there at very, very young as a teenager or her early 20s, and she was known as this beautiful wedding dress designer. So this
Mhm.
article is interviewing her about, what are the changing trends in brides, talking about all of her fantastic dresses. She had made hundreds of wedding dresses by this
Oh,
point in her early 20s. But she also talks about how when she attends these weddings, she wears a maid's uniform. She attends these weddings to make sure that everything fits correctly. She's not just dressing the bride, she's dressing the bridesmaid, she's dressing the mother of the bride,
yes.
sometimes the
Yes.
guests. So she shows up to make sure there's no one steps on hems. If anything needs repair, she's there. But she wears a maid's uniform. And so
Mm.
even though she's being upheld as this expert, she's still living in the Jim Crow South. She's
Yes.
still navigating these relationships. And as her career progresses, she moves to New York. She does have a lot of clients who are trying to haggle with her, trying to lower the prices. These are some of the richest women in America. And so, there's all of these dynamics that she constantly deals with, balancing, her self perception. She knows that she's an amazing designer, that she's a worthy and
Yes.
dignified person,
Yes.
balancing it with kind of the expectations of the white women she deals with. And she has very close relationships. She has a lot of admiration for many people, white women in her life. But you
Hmm.
know that there's always these kind of these dynamics, not just because of race, but because of class.
Yes, and the idea that somehow she is in the laboring class, even if the work that she's doing is so artful,
Hmm.
right? And I
Absolutely.
think and that's one of the things I appreciated about seeing the gowns in person is that and this is something you all can get as well from the monograph. I would highly recommend this book. It is a beautiful coffee table book, and when you read it, the work in it is so powerful and so thoroughly well researched, but also easy to read. I really feel like I learned a lot. And speaking of one of the things that's in the monograph is that you honor the work of the person that kind of helped you get started on this, and that was Margaret Powell, who passed away before she got a chance to see this work come to fruition. Can you talk a bit about Margaret Powell and her work and why you thought it important to reproduce a condensed version of her thesis in the book?
So, Margaret Powell is an amazing scholar, and she was really the first person to take a serious academic look at Anne Lowe. Anne Lowe had appeared in smaller books, mention, kind of books that survey Black designers, but no one had
Mhm.
really dug into her biography before Margaret Powell did so for her master's thesis in 2012. So, I met with her. I first met her when I was interning at the Smithsonian. She was in DC at that time, and we stayed in touch. In fact, she was meant to write a chapter on Anne Lowe for an edited volume I did on Black designers. Very unfortunately, she died of cancer in
Mm.
2019. But she is the person who conceived of the exhibition that we have at Winterthur and the resulting book. She is the engine behind all of it. She first encountered Anne Lowe through an object at the Hillwood Museum, which is the home of Marjorie Merriweather Post in Washington, D.C. She worked at the Carnegie Museum as well as Winterthur, and it was her genius that was pulling all of this together. When she passed away, Winterthur very kindly asked me to curate the exhibition, and we dedicated it to Margaret because she was an amazing scholar, but such a kind person. Everyone who came in contact with her loved her, and so we were so happy to be able to bring her vision to life.
And I think when I attended the symposium as well as the exhibition, I could feel that she was being honored through this. I remember some folks mentioning this at the beginning of some of the lectures on Friday. There's a lovely picture of her with, some comments about the work that she did. So it really is this beautiful way that Black women are uplifting and supporting other Black women, making sure that we remain cited, making sure that, because citation is an important practice, in academics, right? Like the reason that your work does not get forgotten is that other people cite it. And not only did you cite it, but you included it in the book. And I just thought that was so beautiful. Hey, friends. Hey, I know you're enjoying the audio version of Stitch Please, and thanks so much for listening. But you're missing out on all the great stuff going on behind the scenes. That's why I'm inviting you to join our Black Women Stitch Patreon. For as little as $5 a month, you can see all the video versions of the podcast. Plus, you get some amazing swatch cards. You know how much I love these swatch cards. Look, see how cool these are? I Oh wait, you can't see them because you are not yet on the Patreon. So when you join the Patreon, you'll be able to see this, me showing you these amazing cards. We also have some great perks at the other tiers, like discounts, swag, office hours, and more. Don't be the last sewist in the group now. Head over to patreon.com/blackwomenstitch or click the link in the show notes and become a Patreon supporter today. We truly cannot do this without you. So thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about building out a symposium. Why did you think it was important to not just have the exhibition at this gorgeous, gorgeous estate in Delaware? It was a beautiful experience. It was huge, y'all. It was huge, and we had to take a bus to go from the venue where the conference was being held to where we could see the gowns. Why was it important to have a symposium and to pull together all of the people, including your mentors from the Smithsonian, to come through and have these conversations about Lowe?
Well, there's so many amazing scholars who are working on Lowe or working on Black fashion who have so much to contribute. And people working kind of in contemporary spaces, advocating and designing, working in fashion. And so it was really important for us. For me and for Winterthur, Alexandra Deutsch and Kim Collison at Winterthur, who helped organize the exhibition. It was really important for us to bring these people together and, put them in conversation with an audience. And we were able to, think about her history, think about her impact, think about contemporary Black designers, but also the conservation work that went into the exhibition. Winterthur is really one of the only venues that could have put on this exhibition. The
Mm.
conservation work that went into mounting these dresses, doing repairs when needed, it was absolutely phenomenal. We also recreated the Jacqueline Kennedy dress that Anne Lowe
Yes.
designed. And that was a project through Winterthur and the University of Delaware. And so all of these people coming together to talk about their work not only was a way for us to honor Anne Lowe, honor Margaret Powell, and all the scholars who are working on it, but also really advance the field in terms of research, in terms of conservation, in terms of experiential kind of hands-on research. So bringing these people together and having a couple of days where we could talk about this. We also had Precious Lavelle, who's an artist who's thinking
Yes.
about Black women in fashion. Bringing these people together was really important for us to kind of move the conversation forward and have this dialogue of exchange where we can expand the scholarship.
And I wanna talk about bringing in the students. I'll start with the recreation of the wedding gown. I think that is one of the gowns for which she is most noted. Jackie Bouvier's wedding to John F. Kennedy, and I believe the original dress is, you said it's undisplayable. It's at the Kennedy Library in
hmm
Boston, but it's in terrible condition and can't be moved. Can you talk about that process? Because the recreation of the dress, why was it important to recreate it? And when I look back at the notes about how much time it took the team to create the dress versus Anne Lowe to create the dress, that it's amazing. So can you just tell us a bit about this gown and about the significance of having Anne Lowe be the person to create this what became an iconic gown?
Absolutely. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of the gown and then I'll talk a little bit about the recreation. So Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy's 1953 wedding dress is by far Anne Lowe's most famous dress. This was a dress that was photographed nationally, internationally, and has, been on people's pin boards, inspiration boards for their weddings, since that time.
Right.
Lowe was chosen as the designer because she was the go-to designer of Janet Auchincloss, who was Jacqueline's mother. So Anne Lowe made Jacqueline Bouvier, Lee Bouvier, and their stepsister, Nina Auchincloss. She made all of their debutante gowns before this. So she was a family dressmaker. So she was selected to create this gown. She talks about in later interviews how Jacqueline came in with her mother. They discussed the silhouette. She sketched for her, and they designed this beautiful gown. Lowe designed this beautiful gown for her. And so, big commission. We knew Kennedy had been debutante of the year when she came out in 47. So this was a big society wedding. John F. Kennedy was already a senator.
Right.
10 days before the wedding, a water pipe burst in Anne Lowe's workroom and it ruined the wedding dress along with several of the bridesmaids' dresses. Anne Lowe had to pull on every person in her network who could help her, all the women who worked in her shop, but women from her church, even her son. Pitched in and helped with the sewing. They had to recreate all of these pieces. So she recreated this Jackie Kennedy wedding dress that she had already spent 2 months making. She recreated it in 5 days. And they used the other 5 days to recreate all the bridesmaids' dresses. She ran out the clock and hand delivered the dresses to Newport, Rhode Island the morning of the wedding. She was a consummate professional. She got it done. She never mentioned this to Janet Auchincloss, and instead of making a profit, she took a $2,000 loss, $2,000 in the 1950s on this commission. the most kind of think heartbreaking part about this is that she was not widely publicized as the dress's designer. And there's a lot of reasons for this. The fact that she was a Black woman, the fact that she was an American designer, there was just not as much cachet in kind of announcing that. Also, this kind of culture of who are you wearing was not kind of the same today as
Mm.
it was back then. So there's a lot of reasons. It certainly could have been mentioned. It would not have been unusual for her name to be mentioned, but it wasn't. And so that was a really heartbreaking kind of part of that experience, which ended up kind of being a disaster. However, this dress was her calling card. Her clients knew that she made it. People in the know knew that she made it. And she always displayed images of it in her salon after that. It was her calling card.
It's such a beautiful gown, and I remember in one of the news articles that you shared, at the symposium, it talked about someone saying, "Oh, she wore a dress made by a Negro designer, no couture or no haute couture," or something like that, and I saw that and I thought and I'm not clearly this person well, maybe I don't know, you tell me what you think. I thought it was just straight up racism. I thought that this person just believed that a Black person could not make couture because that was just a racist assumption on their part. But could it have been part of what you were saying? Haute couture is something that only Parisians can do. Do you think it was the former or the latter or a little bit of both?
I think it was both. So this was an article that appeared a little bit after the wedding when Mrs. Kennedy was first lady. It appeared in the Ladies' Home Journal, and it was going back and kind of talking about Mrs. Kennedy, and then it goes back to talk about her wedding. And the journalist specifically says her dress was made by a colored woman dressmaker, not the haute couture. And Anne Lowe was very offended by this. She actually wrote a letter to Mrs. Kennedy's secretary complaining about this. And she writes, I refer to myself as a noted Negro designer. And she said, in every way I am. Negro was the, parlance of her times. That's what she wanted, how she wanted to be referred to. And so they went back and forth. She wanted the Ladies' Home Journal to publish a retraction. They never did, as far as I know. But she was standing up for herself because she did not
Yes.
want to be kind of spoken about in this way. And for Mrs. Kennedy's credit, her secretary wrote back and said that that was not words that came from her, and that she did not approve that kind of vocabulary. But Lowe was not positioned as kind of a noteworthy fashion designer at that time. This was something that was starting to happen in the later 60s at the end of her career as she got more and
Mhm.
more press and she was able to tell her own story. But even at that point, she would not have been considered on the same level as French couturiers. No American designers were. The fact that she was a woman, the fact that she was Black were further kind of marks against that for her.
Yes, and I wondered if you could talk a bit about the rise of the Black elite. Well, not the rise, the Black elite, we've always had the Black elite among us at all times, but I think, you said that she was especially proud of working with Elizabeth Mance,
Yes.
and the work that she did for this can you tell us about this Atlanta family and, this wealthy family and the daughter as a pianist? Talk about what it meant for her to sew for an elite Black family, finally, as it sounded like she was pretty excited about that.
So this would have been in the mid to late 60s. We have two dresses that are noted in the book that were sewn for Elizabeth Mance. And so Elizabeth Mance was the daughter of Dr. Robert Mance. They were a very prominent Washington, D.C. Black family. He was not only a doctor, he was a international civil rights leader and church leader. And so, a very prominent family, very well to do. And Lowe made a concert dress for Elizabeth Mance. She was a pianist, a international pianist. She went to Oberlin College. She performed in Europe. And this dress is absolutely spectacular because it shows you just how closely Anne Lowe thought about these dresses and how they'd be used. It's satin and then covered with this kind of stiffer lace, but you see a beautiful break in the lace on a diagonal towards the middle of the skirt. And then the bow in the back is set off center. And all of these elements are designed so that the dress drapes beautifully while she is sitting at a piano at this specific angle that she would be to the audience as a pianist. So it's absolutely gorgeous. It's an act of engineering as well as art.
Yes.
But Lowe also made her 1968 wedding dress, and that is the most contemporary piece that we have featured in the book. From very late in her career, Lowe suffered from eye problems from like the late 50s to the 60s, and she was almost blind by the time that she took this
Mm.
commission. But she had so many decades of muscle memory in her hand, she could still produce. And of course, she had people that she had trained who were working for her. So she made Elizabeth Mance's wedding gown as well as the bridesmaids and junior bridesmaids gowns. But it was and she talked about, how important it was for her that she could sew for this prominent Black family. And we do know that she had other Black clients. In the late 50s, there's an image of a woman named Idella Koch, who was a Harlem socialite. And she's pictured in the New York Age wearing an Ann Lowe dress. And it's credited Ann Lowe made Mrs. Koch's Easter dress. So we know, and there might be others that we don't have documented for, but she certainly sewed for, again, as you said, people who could afford the level that she was making. But to have this kind of prominent Black family, be covered in the press and wearing her dress, she attended the wedding. That was really important for her. And in the civil rights kind of era, in this 60s era where we start to see more Black pride and Black power become acceptable nationally, she's able to talk about that in newspapers. That's not something that newspapers wanted to hear in the 40s or 50s.
Absolutely.
So it's this space where she can finally kind of think more about race, where she was not really able to, make that a part of her kind of activism early on. Her activism was representation, was being in the room, was her beautiful art.
Yes, absolutely. And I appreciate the way that you're drawing our attention to how she attends the wedding. Because I think there's a photograph of, like, I think Elizabeth with a bright smile on her face going up the steps with her dad to the church. And Anne Lowe is getting out of the car with one of her signature hats. And it's like, wow, unlike the white folks' weddings she would attend in the 30s and 20s and 40s, she's a guest.
Mm-hmm.
She's dressed as a guest. She is not dressed as a maid.
Yeah.
She can go here and be seen as family. She can come and really be included in the social environment rather than only having to stay in, quote unquote, her place.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It's a huge change. And we were so lucky to be able to feature these pieces in the book and the exhibition because they come from the Mance's family. Diane Mance, who was maid of honor, she's the custodian of that dress today in Silver Spring, Maryland, as well as Betty Wooden and Sybil Gant, two of the bridesmaids, lent their dresses. So be able to talk to them about wearing the dresses, the experiences that they had, at that time, that was really, really special. And to be able to put their pieces on display and photograph them for the book, it's great to be able to give exposure to these private collections.
And I wanted just to talk just very quickly about the construction of some of the Anne Lowe gowns, in particular about the bodices. You were saying that Lowe has a particular style for how she built out a dress bodice. And just as a refresher, y'all, I know many folks who listen sew, but one of the great advantages of a couture gown is that it is so made for you that it's like you don't even need like the bra or a foundation garment in order to wear it properly. All of that is built in. All of that, all of the bust, the everything that you need. Can you talk about what made Anne Lowe's bodices so distinct so that when you were going through hundreds of dresses and looking through these documents, when you opened up a dress, you could say, oh yeah, that's hers.
So she built, and this is her work from the 50s and 60s, where we do see much more structured pieces. We do have pieces from the 20s and 30s, and she made dresses. She built dresses the way, that was fitting those silhouettes. But she built these bodices with pads over the bust, and then she would create like little threads to make a channel to thread through elastic under the bust. She would have an elastic stay tape that wrapped around the rib cage, and then a non-elastic stay tape that wrapped around the waist. And it's the specific way, and these would include bones. The specific way she put this all together is very recognizable. So Lowe worked for Saks Fifth Avenue between 1960 and 1962, and those dresses are labeled with Saks Fifth Avenue labels, not her name. But because we can look at a dress and say, like, we can tell this is from the early 60s. There's one dress in particular from a private collector, Adnan Couturier, where it had a Saks label. It was from the early 60s. It had these beautiful floral appliques, which is such a mainstay in her work. But it was when we opened it up and compared the bodice to all the other bodices that look so similar that we were able to say, this is an Anne Lowe dress. And that's really special because if there's no label in a dress, it's very, very hard to identify it. So the fact that she built these bodices in this very specific way is allowing us to discover more Anne Lowe that's out there. People have pieces in their collection that might have a label or have a Saks label or might not have a label, and we can look at the inside and say, this is a Lowe.
This is one of the things I appreciate about having the students be involved. And I wanted to just turn to just a few statistics. I think when you look at Anne Lowe by the numbers, or when you try to like imagine how she was able to build this and build these gowns in such a way that it took a team of students. Like, I think the original took 2 months and 5 days. Well, 2 months for the first and then 5 days, but the recreation is 250 hours over 6 months. Like, a team of students spent 6 months working on a recreation of a gown that Ann Lowe made twice in less time.
In less time. So I'll go back to the Kennedy reproduction. So she did have this really beautiful way of making bodices, but with this particular dress, she built this bodice. She cut the panels that go over the waistline on the bias, and it creates this absolute gorgeous fit. And it kind of
Yes.
connects under the bust, under the pleating. But it also has this very wide, heavy skirt with all of these circular rosettes. So it's very heavy. And so really the original dress didn't stand a chance. It was, it was designed to be made for one day. And so,
Yes.
of course, it's on display at the Kennedy, has been on display at the Kennedy Library because of Mrs. Kennedy. And so it was not in a position for us to be able to put on display for Winterthur. So we turned to University of Delaware professor Katja Rolsey. She is a fashion design professional. She teaches it. She knows it. And she was able to go look at the original dress with Kate Sommel, the head of conservation at Winterthur. They spent 3 days at the Kennedy Library taking measurements, taking pictures, getting every detail they could. And then she went back and she spent 6 months recreating it. So she redraped it and she tried to, match it as closely as possible to the original. And she enlisted students from the University of Delaware's apparel design program, which is the program that I attended way back in the early 2000s.
Love that.
To kind of work on all of like the details of this dress, just the miles of swag, the stitching, everything, so much of it hand stitched. So we have this gorgeous recreation from Katja and her team that can now live on. We'll give it back to the JFK Library so they'll have an exhibitable piece. And it's what I really love about it is that Katja and her students just ended up learning so much more about Anne Lowe and the way she worked than I think anyone else could have by in detail studying how things were stitched together, how they went together, all of these design decisions. And you really see the difference between an haute couture gown, custom made for a particular person and, something that would be made available, ready to wear.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about bringing in the contemporary Black designers. You brought in, and B. Michael was there at the symposium, but you had images, and you had pieces from Dapper Dan, you had pieces from Tracy Reese. Why was that important to bring in contemporary Black designers in an Ann Lowe exhibition?
We really wanted to show how her legacy was impacting fashion today. And so we do that through a number of ways. B. Michael may be the most obvious connection because he creates couture in New York City. New York City is a fashion city dominated by ready-to-wear. That's what they're known for. But through
Mhm.
this show, we wanted to show that there was this American couture tradition, and B. Michael's the perfect embodiment of that. We were able to show a beautiful dress that he designed for the editor, Dawn Davis, that she wore to the Met Gala. And he embroidered on her request the names of Black designers Elizabeth Keckley, Jay Jackson, Patrick Kelly, and Anne Lowe on the hem of this gorgeous dress. And Dawn Davis talked about how she wanted to bring all of these designers with her into the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So that was one that we were very, very lucky to be able to borrow, but also other couture pieces that he created. Dapper Dan is also a couturier, even though he has kind of obviously a different kind of clientele. But when he talks about, he talks about design as trying to bring out the personality of the wearer. I really
Mhm.
believe that Anne Lowe worked in a very similar way.
Yes.
So we had this beautiful floral cape that he made for Bevy Smith on display as well. And Kim Goldson, who was on Project Runway, we had a Bevy Smith dress designed by her, as well as a piece by Bishme Kamarte, also on Project Runway. So we wanted to think about media and the role that media played in building up the persona of a fashion designer, which is something Lowe engaged in later in her career. But she
That's
appeared on
right.
television. She was in a lot of magazines and newspapers, telling her own story and building her brand. The last two designers we showed were Amsal, Amsal Abara is a wedding dress designer who created a beautiful brand called Amsal starting in the 1980s. She has since passed, much too young, but she's one of the only Black designers besides Virgil Abloh who has a fashion house that outlives them. But
Wow.
her specialty was in weddings, just like Anne Lowe. And then Tracy Reese is such a beautiful embodiment of a woman designer, a Black woman designer. And the pieces that she picked out for us were really paid homage to these dressmaker details that she associated with Anne Lowe. So in that way, we kind of think about her contemporary impact.
I really appreciate that, especially the Tracy Reese, because Tracy Reese has designed patterns for Vogue, Vogue patterns for sewing, and I have made those patterns. And I was gonna wear the dress that I had made, but I couldn't find it. But it reminded me that it was a lot of work. It was called an advanced pattern, and there was a lot of like under stuff that was required to make the Tracy Reese dress. And now I'm like, oh, that's why it was so hard. Okay, I understand now. This all makes sense. That it was just so wonderful. I want to end before I get to our last question about why you thought it was important to include student voices in the symposium. So the students got a chance to talk about the work, the many, many hours that they spent creating and, creating this dress alongside their professor. Why was it important to have that meet and greet with them?
Well, certainly we wanted to show students the legacy of Anne Lowe, and it's such an important way, a tactile way of learning about this. It's a master class in kind of artisanship and dressmaking. But
Mm.
Katya, as a professor, it was really important for her to bring in students and share Anne Lowe's legacy, particularly students of color, and really share this legacy with them. Have them contribute to this beautiful work. These were students that she picked who had the skills, the incredible skills to kind of help her recreate this dress. And so by bringing in that student element, we're able to kind of pass the baton on to the next generation. And that was really important. I met with the students. They were so sweet and so kind and worked so hard to help Katya bring this recreation to life. And so we were so happy to be able to kind of, have this intergenerational project.
I got that same vibe. I think that is absolutely so true. And then the idea of the things that they walk away with. I think one of the students was saying how, as she was working on the dress, she was imagining Anne Lowe doing these similar steps, but not getting the credit that she deserved simply because of the time in which she was born, and that made a big impression on her as a Black designer, like right now, as
Hmm.
someone who wants to study this. And so I thought that that was a nice way for them to get truly kind of tactile, kinetic learning
Yes.
about this really powerful piece. Now, tell us about what you have coming up for the end of the year. So the Low exhibition has wrapped up, but the book, y'all get the book, and you can get the recordings from Winterthur. You can get the recordings of the symposium. So if you were not able to attend, you can now attend by getting these videos. But what do you have coming up?
So at the museum at FIT, I'm working on a show for fall 2024, and it's called Africa's Fashion Diaspora. So this is a much more contemporary kind of exhibition, but as a scholar of Black American history through fashion, but more generally, I've drawn so many resources, historical resources. There's been this ongoing conversation about transnational Black culture, whether this
Mm,
exists or not. So we see W.E.D. Du Bois, we see Paul Gilroy, we see people like Marcus Garvey
mhm.
thinking about like in what ways are Black people across different countries similar? Do they have a similar culture? And so we certainly don't want to kind of venture into any ideas about essentialism, but I mean, they're really, because there's this ongoing conversation, I really wanted to explore it through fashion design. So I'm looking at contemporary designers and how they're drawing inspiration across the diaspora. We have beautiful pieces. There's a Ivorian brand called Kente Gentleman who did this
Mm.
collection inspired by Miles Davis. Or
Oh,
we have Sindiso Kumalo is a South African designer who did a collection inspired by Harriet Tubman. But we have all of these cross diasporic connections and these conversations and networks that these designers are drawing on. And so sometimes they're looking at inspiration more local to them, but I think about all these designers and how these are similar, telling similar stories. Whether it's about diasporic second generation heritage, whether it's about lineage or sustainability or textiles. So I'm looking at all these different lenses, and really it's all about kind of the storytelling power of fashion.
yes, that sounds so powerful, and just hearing about it sounds amazing. I cannot wait to see the pieces, when you walk through the museum to see this come to life because I know it's gonna be amazing. If it is anything remotely as well researched and as trenchant and as lovingly curated as the Anne Lowe work, I know it's gonna be staggering. So, I'm gonna ask you our last question. The slogan of the Stitch Please podcast is that we will help you get your stitch together. I think I'm going to ask you the question twice. I'm going to ask you to answer as what Anne Lowe might say to help us get our stitch together, and also what you, Elizabeth Way, would say to help us get our stitch together.
In terms of Anne Lowe, I think that she really advocated for the creativity of fashion. She really saw it as an art form, and she really saw that creativity as the driving force of her life. She was a mother, she was a wife, and she talks about how her second marriage, really took a back seat to her profession. She certainly kind of worked with her son. He was a bookkeeper with her fashion design company, but so many aspects of her life revolved around that. She used it to teach other Black women, to empower them with the same skills that her mother and grandmother empowered her with. But it was all channeled through this creativity and this drive to create. She talks about dreaming of these dresses. Even after she loses her sight, she said, there's so many dresses in my mind I want to create. So I think that she would advise people to really embrace that creativity, to take it seriously, to nurture it, and to put that into your sewing, or perhaps, any other kind of creative outlet, but definitely to pay attention to that creative drive.
Excellent. Now, how about you? What is Elizabeth Way's answer for us?
For me, as a curator and historian, I would say that you can enhance your sewing practice through history. I think it's great to read about past designers, look at historical pieces, objects in museums, and see what kind of inspiration that can give you to expand your sewing practice.
I love it. That's wonderful. Look, we got 2 bits of advice on one show. This is wonderful. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being with us today. We are so grateful to have you. We're so grateful to have your work in the world. And so grateful to have you here on the show today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Stitch Please, the official podcast of Black Women Stitch, the sewing group where Black Lives Matter. We appreciate you joining us this week and every week for stories that center Black women, girls, and femmes in sewing. We invite you to join the Black Women Stitch Patreon community with giving levels beginning at $5 a month. Your contributions help us bring the Stitch Please podcast to you every week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support. And come back next week and we'll help you get your stitch together.